What most people call the beginning of soccer history is really the end of a much messier story. Before the first World Cup, the game was already being used by rich schools to shape young men, by clubs to pay and recruit talent, by businessmen to sell products, and by countries trying to prove who mattered. And if you go back far enough, you realize the World Cup didn't arrive out of nowhere. It showed up after years of quiet fighting over money, pride, and control. You're standing on a muddy field in the 1800s, and the first thing that hits you is how different this world feels. There are no giant stadiums, no TV cameras, no sponsors on shirts. Just a group of boys in old clothes running around a patch of grass because someone decided this was a good way to keep them busy. These were elite schools in England, and football was never really about fans at first. It was about discipline. It was about order. It was about taking a bunch of young men with too much energy and giving them something to do with it. That detail matters because it changes the whole way you see the sport. A lot of people think soccer started as a pure working class game and then got bigger from there. But the roots go the other way too. The earliest organized version of it was tied to privilege. It grew inside places where future leaders were trained, where habits were formed, and where the people in charge were already learning how to use sport as a tool. Then the game starts spreading. It moves out of those schools and into clubs, into towns, into places where people actually want to watch it, not just use it as training. And once that happens, the money problem shows up fast. Because now you've got clubs wanting better players, crowds wanting better games, and no one agreeing on whether players should be paid at all. That's where things get interesting. For a long time, the clean version of the sport said players should stay amateur. They were supposed to play for pride, for honor, for the shirt, all that stuff. But the real world was already moving differently. Working-class clubs were quietly paying players because if you wanted to win, you needed talent. And if you wanted to keep talent, you needed money. So even before the World Cup, soccer had this hidden economy under it. Some clubs had more resources. Some had better crowds. Some had more reach. Some could afford to pay in ways others couldn't. And that created a gap that was bigger than just skill on the field. It was about who had the better system, the better network, the better way to turn football into something sustainable. You can almost picture it like a business before it knows it's a business. Now look at the first international matches. The one that gets talked about a lot is Scotland against England in 1872. And what's wild is how small it feels compared to the modern game. A few thousand people show up. The players are mostly tied to one club or one region. The formations are strange by today's standards. The whole thing feels raw, like a prototype. But that prototype matters because it shows you something important. Before the World Cup, people were already trying to see who was best across borders. They were already asking the same question we still ask now. Which country has the real edge? Who plays the smarter game? Who owns the pride? And for a while, the answer to that question wasn't the World Cup at all. It was the Olympics. That part gets skipped a lot. Before 1930, Olympic football was one of the biggest stages you had. Countries treated it seriously. Winning there meant something. It gave teams a claim to being the best. So now you've got this weird situation where the world already wants an international football stage, but it doesn't have one main home yet. Different events are trying to fill that role. The Olympics are doing part of it. The British Home Championship is doing part of it. Businessmen are even trying to create their own version of it. And that's where the story gets really strange. A tea magnate named Sir Thomas Lipton helped set up a tournament in Turin in the early 1900s. It's often treated like a side note, but it shouldn't be. This was a businessman using football like a marketing machine. He wasn't just funding a trophy because he loved the sport. He was attaching his name to something international and exciting. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because that is basically the modern playbook. Put your brand next to a big event. Make the event feel bigger than the game. Use the game to sell the story. Lipton was doing that before the World Cup even existed. And whether or not people at the time saw it that way, it showed that soccer had already become valuable beyond the pitch. So now you've got schools shaping the game, clubs paying players, countries chasing prestige, and businessmen trying to cash in. That's the world before the first World Cup. It's not one clean path. It's a bunch of paths all moving at once. And the thing is, the tension was getting harder to manage, because the sport kept growing, and every growth created a new problem. If you stayed amateur, you risked losing talent. If you paid players, you changed the spirit of the game. If you only focused on local matches, you left money on the table. If you tried to go international, now you needed travel and organization. That's the point where FIFA starts becoming more important, because now the sport needs a group that can hold all of this together. By the time the first World Cup comes along in 1930, the real story isn't that FIFA invented international football. It didn't. The world had already been building toward this for years. FIFA just became the organization that finally pulled all the loose threads together. And that event had to feel like more than a tournament. Uruguay is the perfect example of that. When the first World Cup is awarded to Uruguay, it isn't only about football quality. Uruguay had already won Olympic gold, so it had real football status. But the hosting decision also lines up with the centenary of Uruguay's independence. That means the tournament wasn't just a sports event. It was a national moment, a celebration, a statement. You can imagine what that looked like on the ground. Flags everywhere, packed stands, the sense that this was bigger than a match, that this was a country trying to show the world who it was. And FIFA understood something valuable there. If you connect football to national pride, the event becomes much bigger than the sport itself. That's the moment the World Cup starts looking like the thing we know today. But the best part is this: it didn't win because it was the first idea. It won because it was the best answer to a bunch of problems that already existed. The world needed one place for international football to land. It needed a tournament that could carry meaning, attract attention, create money, and give countries a way to prove themselves. The World Cup became that thing. It took pieces from the schools, the clubs, the Olympics, the early business experiments, and the old international rivalries, and it turned them into one global stage. And once that happened, soccer never really went back. You start to see the same pattern repeat over and over. Countries using the tournament to build identity. Businesses using it to sell. Players becoming stars that are worth more than just goals. Fans turning games into events that feel bigger than sport. All of that was already there in smaller form before 1930. The World Cup just made it global. That's why this history matters. Because when people talk about football today, they usually talk like the money came later. And the business part showed up after the sport got popular. But the truth is, the game was always moving toward that. The earliest versions of it were already tied to power, status, and profit in one way or another. Even the idea of soccer itself came out of a naming problem. The word started as a way to separate association football from rugby. So from the very beginning, the sport was already dealing with identity, branding, and who got to define what the game even was. That sounds small, but it's part of the same larger story. If you can control the name, you can control the story. And if you can control the story, you can control a lot more than people think. So when you watch a World Cup now, you're not just watching the biggest tournament in soccer. You're watching the final version of a long fight that started in schoolyards, moved through clubs and stadiums, passed through Olympic fields, and got shaped by businessmen who saw the value early. That's the part most people miss. The World Cup didn't create the business of football. It collected it. It organized it. It gave it a global stage. And once that happened, everything changed. Now, with the 2026 World Cup in mind, that story hits even harder because the same forces are still there. Money, prestige, branding, national pride, all of it. The names are different. The scale is bigger, but the game underneath is the same. So, if the World Cup today feels like a giant machine, that's because it is. But it didn't start that way. It was built piece by piece, through fights that most people never hear about. And the weird part is, the real beginning of the World Cup story happened long before the first match in 1930 ever kicked off. It started when soccer first became worth fighting over. If you like this deep dive into football, money, and legacy, you're on the right channel. I break down how the game makes money, moves people, and changes careers. Subscribe, hit the bell, and let's dive into the next story together. No fluff, just the real story behind the game.